If you were standing in Berlin in the early 1940s, listening to the swagger of Hermann Göring, you might have believed the Third Reich was untouchable. He strutted around in those oversized uniforms and glittering medals, always talking big, always promising the impossible. And one of his favorite boasts was that America, this so-called nation of car builders and farm boys, could never build enough planes to challenge the Luftwaffe. He even laughed when he first heard the US talking about producing 50,000 aircraft a year. 50,000. To Göring, that number sounded like something from a child's dream, not a real military plan. He told his officers that if the Americans ever reached such a number, they could call him mayor, a mocking way of saying it would never happen. What he didn't know, what he couldn't see, was that across the ocean, in those same automobile factories he mocked, a quiet storm was forming. Ordinary workers, many of whom had never even set foot on an airport runway, were about to rewrite the rules of modern war production. And in just a few short years, America wouldn't build 50,000 planes. They'd build almost 100,000, enough to turn the sky itself into a weapon. Enough to crush the confidence of a man who once believed he controlled the air. Before we dive into this incredible story, take a moment to hit subscribe, like the video, and share it with someone who loves real history told the human way. It helps more people discover these forgotten stories, and it keeps this channel going. Now let's go back to the moment the United States realized the world was collapsing faster than anyone expected. It was 1940 and Europe was in flames. France had fallen, Britain was fighting alone, and Hitler's war machine looked unstoppable. The Luftwaffe had thousands of aircraft, thousands of trained pilots, and years of combat experience. Meanwhile, America, still officially at peace, had barely a few hundred operational warplanes fit for modern combat. Many of them were outdated even before they reached the runway. The country was not ready. Everyone knew it. But there was a different kind of power inside the United States, one Hitler's intelligence services had misunderstood from the beginning. America didn't have a giant army, but it had something even more dangerous: factories that could outbuild almost any nation on Earth. Not fancy factories either. Just rugged, noisy, sprawling floors filled with the whir of machines, the smell of metal and grease, and the hands of millions of workers who knew how to make things quickly, precisely, and in unbelievable numbers. It all began with a simple but terrifying realization inside the White House. If the Allies were going to survive, then the United States had to become the world's arsenal. President Roosevelt called the heads of the aviation companies, Douglas, Boeing, Lockheed, North American, and told them plainly that America needed more planes than ever imagined. He wasn't thinking small. He wanted tens of thousands. He wanted the types of numbers that would make Göring choke on his own laughter. At the time, American factories were producing only a few thousand aircraft a year. Some of those planes crashed in training more often than they flew in combat. But still, the manufacturers nodded, maybe more out of fear than confidence. And once the order landed, the entire nation shifted. Engineers went home with notebooks full of sketches. Factory supervisors tore up schedules. Workers were retrained overnight. Farmers, teachers, housewives, teenagers, they all lined up to take jobs they never dreamed they would have. America wasn't just preparing for war, it was transforming itself from the inside out. When the first targets were announced, 50,000 aircraft a year, many people inside the American industry actually thought Roosevelt had lost his mind. Even the executives whispered among themselves that it was impossible. A few of the engineers joked that they'd need magic wands, not machine tools. But when the newspapers printed the plan and the country read those numbers, something unusual happened. People didn't roll their eyes. They didn't laugh like Göring. They felt challenged. They felt like the future of freedom depended on them, showing the world what American hands could do. If you walked into the Ford plant in Willow Run during those early days, you would have seen something unbelievable. At first, chaos, blueprints stacked like mountains, parts scattered everywhere, workers trying to figure out where the wing pieces even went. But day by day, the mess turned into order. Ford's engineers broke down aircraft production the same way they once built cars. Instead of small teams painstakingly crafting a single plane, the factories began pushing parts along massive assembly lines. The bomber wasn't so much built as flowed through the plant, piece by piece, until it rolled out fully formed on the other side. And what emerged from those lines was the B-24 Liberator, a heavy bomber that Germany once believed America could never build in real numbers. But the Willow Run factory didn't produce tens of them. It produced thousands. At its peak, it completed one bomber every 63 minutes. Think about that. Every hour, a brand new bomber rolled out ready to fly across an ocean. Meanwhile, Boeing's factories were roaring with B-17 production. North American was turning out the P-51 Mustang, a fighter that would eventually own the skies over Europe. Douglas built transports, attack aircraft, and bombers. Grumman created the Wildcats and Hellcats that would dominate the Pacific. It was like the whole nation became a single giant machine, driven by the determination of workers who understood how much was at stake. One of the most powerful moments from that time comes from the diaries of factory workers, ordinary men and women who had never even seen combat. Some wrote about sewing parachutes, knowing a pilot's life depended on every stitch. Others talked about the fear of making a mistake, especially when they realized that a missing bolt could cost an entire crew their lives. But they kept going, night after night, shift after shift. Some slept in their cars, refusing to miss work. Some brought their kids to the plant because babysitters were impossible to find. They were exhausted, hungry, overwhelmed. And yet, when the final whistle blew each day, they looked at the planes lined up outside and felt an emotion no paycheck could measure. They felt like they were part of something bigger than themselves. And all the while, Göring kept laughing. German intelligence continued feeding him reports claiming that American factories were disorganized, undertrained, and too inefficient to produce serious aircraft numbers. He believed that America's factory workers lacked discipline. He believed the U.S. had no military tradition strong enough to sustain a war of industry. What he didn't realize was that while he was making jokes, America was accelerating faster than any nation in history. By late 1942, the numbers stunned everyone. U.S. plane production didn't just increase, it skyrocketed. Factories produced more aircraft in a single year than Germany could build in several. And while the Luftwaffe lost experienced pilots over Britain, the Mediterranean, the Eastern Front, and later Normandy, America was replacing every loss with 10 new planes and 10 newly trained pilots. The Luftwaffe had no answer for that. No amount of bravado could change mathematics. No boast could change the fact that America had become the greatest industrial force the world had ever seen. By the time 1943 arrived, Allied commanders were openly calling U.S. production the tide that would drown the Axis. Bombers filled the skies in formations so large they stretched across the horizon like a metal storm. Fighters escorted them in numbers Göring once said would be impossible to field. And still the factories pushed on, building day and night. Let me pause for a moment. If you're enjoying this story and want to help more people find these human side of wwii aviation, hit the subscribe button and leave a like. It means a lot, and it keeps this channel alive so we can keep telling these forgotten stories. Now, back to the storm that was brewing over Germany. Germany's air defense network began to feel the weight of that storm long before Göring admitted anything was wrong. Radar operators reported bomber streams so dense they struggled to count them. Civilians stood in the streets of Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin watching the sky darken as thousands of silver shapes crawled overhead like a slow-moving thundercloud. And somewhere deep inside the Reich Air Ministry, Göring realized the joke he'd been repeating for years was turning into a curse he couldn't escape. The Luftwaffe had entered the war with confidence bordering on arrogance. They had exceptional pilots, aces who'd survived Spain, Poland, France, the Battle of Britain. They had fast, agile fighters and solid bombers, but they were built for short, sharp wars, not for a marathon, not for a grinding industrial clash where victory depended not on daring or strategy, but on who could build faster, repair faster, and replace losses faster. America didn't treat warplanes like prized jewels to polish and preserve. They treated them like tools. If one was destroyed, another rolled off the line, and then another, and another. The German pilots began noticing a strange pattern in their battles with American formations. Every time they shot down a B-17 or P-47, the next week even more appeared. Fresh squadrons arrived with brand new engines, perfect wiring, and radios that actually worked. Meanwhile, German aircraft mechanics were running out of spare parts, cannibalizing wrecks, patching fighters with salvaged plates, and sending pilots into combat with machines that rattled, sputtered, and sometimes refused to even start. One pilot wrote in his diary that he felt like he was flying, a ghost held together by prayers. On the American side, the atmosphere was different. Pilots trusted that when they needed replacements would come. They trusted that their machines were carefully assembled with exact standards because they'd seen the factories themselves. Some of them had even stood on a production line before joining the service. More than a few bomber crewmen would point out a component mid-flight, an engine mount, a rudder hinge, a piece of insulation, and say, almost casually, that their sister or uncle or neighbor had made that part. Imagine the comfort of knowing someone you loved had tightened the bolts that kept you alive. In 1943, when the raids deep into Germany truly began, the Luftwaffe still tried to pretend it could win. Göring ordered his fighter wings to hold nothing back, intercept everything, attack formations no matter the cost. But deep inside, his commanders already sensed the truth. They were fighting a machine that couldn't be stopped. The Americans weren't just building aircraft. They were building an entire ecosystem: fuel refineries, ammunition plants, training schools, spare engine factories, new airfields stretching across England, North Africa, and the Pacific. Industrial warfare on a scale that Germany never imagined. One of the turning points came when the P-51 Mustang took to the sky over Europe. Fast, long-range, efficient. A miracle of American and British engineering. Suddenly, bombers weren't alone. They had guardians that could escort them deep into Germany and back. Fighter pilots who once envied the Luftwaffe's experience now found themselves outmatching German veterans in dogfights. And all those Mustangs, they were mass-produced with the same relentless energy that defined America's industrial push. Pilots flying over German cities began noticing something heartbreaking and telling. The factories below were hurting. Smoke rose from bombed-out roofs. Workers struggled to maintain output under constant attacks. Supplies dwindled. The Third Reich's industrial skeleton was cracking. And every time another U.S. plane joined the fight, that crack widened. But beyond the statistics and the strategy, there were thousands of human stories unfolding in those same factories back in America. There was the single mother in Ohio who worked double shifts riveting wing panels, her hands blistered, her back aching, her teenage son fighting in Italy. She wrote to him every week telling him she was helping build the planes flying above him. She wasn't exaggerating. The squadron markings in one photograph matched the aircraft that rolled off her line. There was the Japanese-American man in California who volunteered at an aircraft plant after being released from an internment camp. Despite what his own government had done to him, he built parts for B-24s with fierce focus. In his diary he wrote, "Maybe some part of me is in the sky, trying to make right what has gone wrong." History rarely talks about him. It should. There were high school girls in Kansas who learned to weld better than men twice their age. There were retired machinists in Chicago who returned to the factory floor at 60 years old because they knew their experience mattered. There were entire towns transformed by war where everyone, literally everyone, worked for the aviation industry in some way. If you weren't building planes, you were delivering materials, hauling boxes, feeding workers, or guarding warehouses. America had never worked like this before. It probably never will again. And while the workers pushed themselves to exhaustion, something equally remarkable was happening inside the minds of America's engineers. They stopped thinking about whether a design was possible. They started thinking about how fast it could be built, how easily it could be repaired, how cheaply its parts could be stamped, cast, or welded. That shift in thinking, simple but powerful, was one of the reasons America's aircraft output became unstoppable. They weren't designing perfect machines. They were designing buildable machines. Meanwhile, German engineers produced beautiful aircraft, complex, precise, advanced for their time, but difficult to build and often impossible to mass produce. The Me-262 jet was an engineering marvel, but German factories couldn't produce enough engines. The FW-190 was excellent, but shortages of aluminum and skilled labor slowed production. And even when new designs were ready, Allied bombers were waiting to destroy the factories as soon as they opened. By late 1943, Göring finally stopped laughing. His speeches grew darker. His confidence cracked. He told Hitler that the Luftwaffe needed miracles, new jets, new weapons, a new industrial base, but miracles weren't coming. The factories behind him were collapsing. The workers were starving. The pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. And every day, high above Germany, another wave of American aircraft appeared. Let's pause for a second. If this kind of deep, human storytelling means something to you, hit subscribe and drop a like. It helps the channel grow so I can keep bringing you stories like this, stories that remind us the past was lived by real people with real hopes and fears. Now back to the skies over Europe, where Göring's nightmare was only just beginning. By early 1944, the number of American aircraft in the European theater was staggering. At one point, the US was producing planes faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. During the Big Week offensive in February, Germany threw everything it had into the sky, desperate to stop the Allied bombing campaign. But for every bomber they destroyed, American factories quietly replaced it before the next week's mission. Pilots joked that they could lose their lineup of planes and still have replacements waiting by the time they landed. German pilots described Big Week with bitter honesty. One ace wrote that he watched bomber formations stretch across the sky like a river of metal. Another said it was like fighting a wall of the sky rather than individual aircraft. Their engines overheated, their guns jammed, their bodies shook from exhaustion, and when they returned to base, the command was always the same: go back up anyway. But the Luftwaffe couldn't keep up. Every time they attacked, they took heavy losses. And unlike America, Germany didn't have millions of workers ready to build replacements. Their factories were running out of fuel, steel, aluminum, rubber. Their workers were dying in raids or being drafted into the army. Their supply trains were bombed before reaching airfields. Every part of the system was collapsing. By the summer of 1944, Göring admitted in private that he no longer controlled the air. That was a devastating confession from a man who had once promised Hitler total air supremacy. Publicly, he still put on a show. He still wore the medals. He still gave bold speeches. But the myth was dead. Even German civilians felt it. They would look up during daytime raids and whisper to one another that the Americans must have factories made of magic, because how else could anyone build so many planes? The truth was simpler and far more human. America didn't beat Germany with magic. It beat Germany with people. Millions of ordinary workers who poured their lives into a single mission: to build the planes that would end the war. And they did it so well that even today, historians struggle to fully grasp the scale. By the end of the war, the United States had produced almost 100,000 aircraft in a single year, double Roosevelt's original goal, and more than the combined output of most Axis nations. Now we move toward the final stretch of this story, where Göring faces the full weight of the machine he mocked, and the Allied air forces prepare to strike the final blows that would shatter the Luftwaffe forever. And so we move into those last grim months, when Germany's skies no longer belonged to Göring, but to the thundering presence of Allied aircraft. By late 1944, even the most loyal Luftwaffe officers knew the truth they'd been avoiding for years. They weren't fighting squadrons anymore. They weren't fighting strategy. They were fighting a factory that stretched from New York to Seattle, from Dallas to Detroit. They were fighting the hands of millions of workers they would never meet. They were fighting the idea that no matter how many American planes fell blazing from the sky, twice as many would rise to take their place. And Göring, well, the laughter that had once echoed through his marble halls had gone quiet. He'd mocked Roosevelt's goal of 50,000 planes, calling it childish, calling it American bravado. But now he sat in briefings staring at reports that showed numbers so high, even he had trouble believing them. Entire airfields full of Mustangs, hangars jammed with Liberators, rows of B-29s stretching to the horizon in the Pacific. One German officer said listening to those reports felt like watching our own shadow grow longer until it swallowed us. By early 1945, something almost surreal began happening. Allied pilots could fly deep into Germany and barely see a German fighter. Sometimes they'd fly past airfields full of planes that never left the ground. There simply weren't enough trained pilots left. The Luftwaffe, once feared, once unmatched, had become a ghost of its former self. And the final humiliation came from exactly the source Göring had mocked years earlier: American industry. A few captured Luftwaffe officers admitted after the war that they never truly understood the American war machine until they saw the factories themselves. They expected dark, smoke-filled, prison-like workshops. Instead, they saw bright plants filled with music and laughter and posters encouraging workers to take pride in their craft. They saw cafés, Rias serving hot meals. They saw workers treated with something the Nazi regime never offered: dignity. Those officers realized something painful. America didn't just build better machines. It built people who believed they had a stake in victory. Meanwhile, in Germany, workers labored under air raids, hunger, fear, and punishment. It's hard to build miracles under conditions like that. It's hard to manufacture hope. But there's something I want to talk about that often gets overlooked. When we talk about America building 100,000 planes, it can sound cold, mechanical, like pushing numbers on a factory ledger. But those planes weren't numbers. They were stories, lives, families, futures. Think of the father who built bomb racks during the week and wrote bedtime stories for his kids at night. Think of the woman who welded fuselage panels with hands scarred from years of factory work, knowing her husband was fighting in the Ardennes. Think of the young couples who met on assembly lines, fell in love between rows of engines, and later told their children that they helped win a war with nothing more than sweat and stubbornness. There's a kind of quiet heroism in that, not the loud kind, not the kind with medals or parades, but the kind that keeps a nation standing when the world is falling apart. Now let me slip in a quick moment before we finish. If you've watched this far, it means you love history told in a way that feels alive. Do me a favor and hit subscribe, drop a like, and share this with someone who enjoys these deep dives as much as you do. That support helps me keep these stories going. Now back to the final chapter of this strange, almost unbelievable journey, from Göring's laughter to the shadow of 100,000 American warbirds stretching across the sky. As 1945 rolled in, Germany faced a kind of defeat that wasn't captured by territory on a map. It was a defeat of spirit. Civilians looked up and saw B-17s, B-24s, and Mustangs cruising overhead with no escort problems, no fuel shortages, no fear of interception. They saw a sky owned by the enemy. German soldiers on the ground wrote home saying they'd stopped even trying to count the planes. One wrote simply, "The sky hums." But another wrote, "We knew the war was lost when the American planes flew low and slow, and no one shot at them." It wasn't arrogance, it was exhaustion. And Göring, the man who'd once strutted in silk robes, the man who believed the Luftwaffe would rule the skies forever, now rode in the back of a car with the curtains closed, listening to distant engines and wondering how everything he'd built had fallen apart. There's something almost Shakespearean about that image, a man undone not by one enemy pilot, but by millions of ordinary workers who never even carried a weapon. After the war, many Luftwaffe veterans spoke openly about the turning point. It wasn't a battle. It wasn't the loss of a specific plane. It was the realization that Germany simply couldn't build fast enough to keep up. One pilot said that fighting American air power was like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. Another said, they didn't win with brilliance or with luck, they won with persistence. It's hard not to feel the weight of that persistence, millions of hours, millions of hands, from the foundries of Pittsburgh to the hangars of California. But here's something that always strikes me when I revisit these stories. The people who built those planes rarely thought of themselves as heroes. They were doing their jobs, supporting their families, trying to bring loved ones home sooner. And maybe that's why the numbers grew the way they did, because when an entire nation decides the job needs doing and they all put their shoulders into it, the impossible becomes possible. That's why Roosevelt's goal of 50,000 planes wasn't crazy. It was a spark, and America didn't just meet it, it doubled it, not because Göring laughed, but because the workers believed. There's a final image historians sometimes talk about. April 1945, a German child standing outside his village, watching a formation of American bombers flying overhead so thick they seemed to block the sun. He's too young to understand the politics or the war. He just stares, wide-eyed. A U.S. bomber gunner later wrote in his journal that he looked down at that same child and wondered what kind of world that boy would grow up in when the war was over. That child survived. Many didn't, but he remembered those planes for the rest of his life, not with hatred, but with awe, because even a child could see they represented something bigger than war. They represented what happens when a nation decides it will not break. And that brings us to our ending, one that loops back to something much older than jets and factories and arguments between generals. It brings us back to human spirit, to determination, to the quiet resolve that carried not just bomber crews and fighter pilots, but also the workers who gave them wings. And in a strange way, it reminds me of another group entirely, the dambusters, a handful of men flying into darkness with barely a chance of coming home, carrying a mission the world thought impossible. Their spirit wasn't born in machines. It was born in courage, in responsibility, in the belief that some things are worth risking everything for. That same spirit lived in the workers building those American planes, in the pilots flying them, in the families waiting at home, ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And when the dust of the war finally settled, that spirit is what endured. Not Göring's laughter. Not the factories burning. Not the wreckage scattered across Europe. Just the simple, stubborn human belief that even in the darkest moments, people can rise and push and build something that reaches for the sky. And that's where this story ends, with the echo of engines fading into the clouds and the quiet hope that the world, after everything, still had the strength to begin again.